Well, well, look who decided to show up. The moment she walked through those gates, Ebony J. Rubin knew she was walking into enemy territory. But she also knew something they didn't, something her late husband had hidden in a brown envelope that would turn their world upside down. She just had to survive the next hour. It was 2:00 in the afternoon on a bright Tuesday. A woman dressed in a modest pink dress, clutching a worn leather handbag in both hands, walked through the towering iron gates of the Anderson family mansion. The moment she stepped onto the marble courtyard, every head turned. Business executives in tailored suits, extended relatives dripping in designer labels, associates with champagne glasses frozen midair. All eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The woman's name was Ebony J. Rubin. In one hand, Ebony held her handbag like a lifeline. In the other, a folded tissue she'd used to wipe away tears that morning. Slowly, deliberately, she walked toward the grand entrance where the estate gathering was being held. At the doorway stood a reception assistant checking names against a guest list. But before Ebony could reach her, a voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. James Anderson. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He stood at the top of the entrance steps, arms crossed, blocking her path. Beside him, his sister Mabel, pristine white suit, diamond earrings catching the sunlight, smiled with venom in her eyes. The whispers intensified. "That's her, the broke wife. What is she doing here? Does she really think she belongs with us?" Ebony reached the bottom step and spoke softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'm here for the reading of Jonathan's will. He would have wanted me here." James let out a sharp laugh. "Your husband is dead, Ebony, and with him, your free ride ends today. This isn't your home anymore." Mabel stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble. "You don't belong here. You never did. We tolerated you while our brother was alive, but now?" She gestured dismissively toward the gates. "Security can show you the way out, or should I call them now?" Every person in the courtyard had stopped their conversations. Phones were being pulled out. Some were recording. Others whispered behind manicured hands. Ebony could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force, but she didn't move. "I have every right to be here," Ebony said quietly, her fingers tightening around her handbag. "Jonathan left instructions. I was told to attend." James sneered. "Instructions? The only instruction you need is this: leave, before we drag you out ourselves." And then, to Ebony's horror, James descended the steps. Mabel followed, her smile widening. Together, they approached her like predators circling wounded prey. James grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. Mabel pushed at her shoulder. "Move!" James hissed. The crowd gasped. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned in closer, their phones capturing every moment. Ebony stumbled backward, her handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the ground. James lifted his foot, as if preparing to shove her further. Mabel laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed across the courtyard. It looked like the ultimate humiliation of a woman everyone believed was powerless. But Ebony didn't run. She bent down, retrieved her handbag, and straightened her pink dress. Her eyes, though wet with unshed tears, remained fixed on the mansion's entrance. Somewhere inside was Christopher Worcester-Bolter, the family lawyer. Somewhere inside was the truth Jonathan had left behind. All she had to do was wait. Inside the mansion's great hall, guests continued to arrive. Business partners exchanged knowing glances. Extended relatives whispered about poor Ebony while secretly relishing her public disgrace. The air was thick with anticipation, not for the will reading, but for the spectacle of a woman being cast out. Standing near the back of the hall was someone who didn't join in the mockery. Her name was Clara Hayes, an elderly woman who had worked as the Anderson family's housekeeper for over 30 years. Clara watched through the tall glass windows as James and Mabel cornered Ebony outside. Her weathered hands clutched a serving tray, knuckles white with suppressed anger. When James finally allowed Ebony to enter, only after a security guard intervened, reminding him that the lawyer had specifically requested her presence, Clara was the only one who met Ebony's eyes with kindness. Ebony was directed to sit in a chair far from the main gathering area, not with the family, not with the business associates, but in a corner near the service entrance where the help typically stood, as if she were a stranger, an intruder. Someone to be tolerated until she could be discarded. Mabel made sure everyone saw where Ebony was seated. "Look at that," she announced loudly, making no effort to lower her voice. "The broke wife relegated to the cheap seats. How fitting." Laughter rippled through the crowd. James joined in. "I wonder if she came here to beg for a severance package. Maybe ask for bus fare home." More laughter. Ebony sat perfectly still, her handbag resting on her lap. She could hear everything they said, every cruel joke, every dismissive comment. But she didn't respond. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly and remembered Jonathan's voice the last time she'd seen him alive. "They don't understand you, Ebony. They never have. But one day they will. And when that day comes, you'll know I kept my promise." What promise? She hadn't understood then. But she trusted him. She always had. Clara approached quietly, holding a glass of water on a tray. She bent down and whispered, "Don't leave, dear. Just wait. The truth always comes out." Ebony looked up at the older woman, grateful for the first kind words she'd heard all day. "Thank you," she whispered back. Clara squeezed her shoulder gently before returning to her duties. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. James and Mabel grew bolder, discussing loudly and within Ebony's earshot how they would divide the Anderson empire. Who would take control of which businesses, which properties they'd sell immediately. Mabel even joked about redecorating that hideous sitting room Jonathan let her use. The other guests watched Ebony like she was part of the entertainment. Some pitied her. Most enjoyed the drama. A few filmed discreetly, likely planning to share the gossip at their next social gathering. Finally, the tall oak doors to the main hall opened. Christopher Bolter, senior partner at Bolter Associates, stepped into the room. He was a dignified man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. In his hands, he carried a brown leather briefcase. The room fell silent. James and Mabel immediately straightened, their faces shifting from cruel amusement to anticipatory greed. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the official confirmation that they would inherit everything their brother had built. Christopher walked to the center of the room, set his briefcase on the marble table, and opened it. He pulled out a thick brown envelope, the kind used for legal documents. Ebony's heart began to pound. Christopher's eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on James and Mabel, then landing on Ebony in her corner seat. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered there. Recognition, perhaps respect. "Thank you all for coming," Christopher began, his voice carrying authority. "Before we begin the formal reading of Jonathan A. Anderson's last will and testament, I want to address what I witnessed moments ago in the courtyard." James shifted uncomfortably. Mabel's confident smile faltered just slightly. "I've served this family for over 20 years, Christopher continued, "and in all that time, I've never seen such disgraceful behavior towards someone who was specifically requested to be here by the deceased himself." Gasps, murmurs, phones immediately came out again. Christopher turned to face James and Mabel directly. "Your brother left very clear instructions. Instructions that concern not just the distribution of his assets, but also his final wishes regarding how his widow was to be treated." Mabel scoffed. "His widow has no claim here. Jonathan built this empire with us. She's nothing but—" "Enough!" Christopher's single word silenced the entire room. He opened the brown envelope, and Ebony, still clutching her handbag in the corner, felt her late husband's presence beside her for the first time since his death. The truth was about to change everything. "Before we get deeper in this, tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments, and if the thought of what Ebony is about to go through already has you curious, then hit that subscribe button and like the video." To understand how Ebony ended up in that corner seat, humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, you need to know the story of how she met Jonathan Anderson. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something deeper, something real, a connection built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a promise that no amount of wealth or family cruelty could break. This is that story. Christopher Worsted-Bolter stood perfectly still at the center of the great hall, the brown envelope still in his hands, but he didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, his sharp eyes swept across the assembled guests, taking in every face, every whispered conversation, every phone screen glowing with recording lights. He was a man who had spent decades reading rooms, understanding power dynamics, and knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work. This was a moment for silence. The guests, sensing that the formal reading wasn't beginning immediately, shifted their attention away from the lawyer and back to their favorite spectacle. Ebony J. Rubin, sitting alone in her corner seat, clutching her handbag like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The whispers started small, like the first drops of rain before a storm. "Look at her. She actually thinks she has a right to be here. I heard she didn't even come from money. Jonathan met her at some charity event." Charity case is more like it. A woman in a burgundy dress, Veronica Chen, one of Mabel's closest friends and a prominent socialite, leaned toward her companion with a voice just loud enough to carry. "Honestly, I always wondered what Jonathan saw in her. She's so plain, no sophistication at all." Her companion, an older gentleman with a gray beard, nodded sagely. "Gold diggers come in all packages these days. The modest ones are often the most dangerous. They play the long game." "Well, her game is over now," Veronica said with satisfaction. "Without Jonathan's protection, she's nothing." Across the hall, a group of business associates huddled together near the refreshment table. These were men who had worked alongside Jonathan Anderson, who had shaken his hand at board meetings and signed contracts bearing his signature. Yet not one of them stepped forward to defend his widow. "I never understood that marriage," one of them muttered, adjusting his Rolex. "Jonathan was brilliant. He could have married anyone. European royalty, tech heiresses, old money. Instead, he chose her." "Maybe it was a tax thing," another suggested, only half joking. "You know how these wealthy men operate, strategic marriages for estate purposes." "If that's true, the strategy just backfired spectacularly," the first man chuckled. "James and Mabel are about to inherit everything, and she'll be out on the street by sunset." Ebony heard every word. Her corner seat, positioned near the service entrance, had been chosen deliberately by Mabel to maximize her humiliation. But it also meant she was close enough to hear the unfiltered conversations, the things people said when they thought she was too broken, too insignificant to matter. Her fingers tightened around the leather handles of her handbag. Inside was nothing of monetary value, just a tissue, her house keys, and a small photograph of Jonathan she'd tucked into the inner pocket that morning. But holding it gave her something to focus on, something to anchor her as the storm of gossip swirled around her. She remembered what her mother used to tell her when she was young and facing bullies at school. "Let them talk, baby. Words only have the power you give them. And you're stronger than their ugliest words." So Ebony sat and waited and let them talk. Mabel Anderson, however, wasn't content with mere whispers. She stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by a small court of admirers and family members, and raised her voice deliberately, loud enough that every single person in the room, including Ebony, could hear her clearly. "This isn't your home anymore, Ebony." The room fell into a hushed anticipation. Even the caterers, moving quietly along the edges of the hall with trays of hors d'oeuvres, paused to listen. Mabel's perfectly manicured hand gestured broadly toward the marble columns, the crystal chandeliers, the priceless artwork lining the walls. "Everything you see here? None of it belongs to you. It never did. You were a guest in our family home. And now that Jonathan is gone, your invitation has been revoked." A few people gasped at the cruelty of it, but more, far more, nodded in agreement, or smiled behind their hands. Ebony didn't flinch. She didn't stand up to defend herself. She didn't shout or cry or storm out in righteous anger. She simply sat there, her posture straight, her hands folded over her handbag, her gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. To anyone watching, she might have appeared defeated. But those who looked closer, like Clara, the elderly housekeeper watching from the doorway, could see the steel beneath her stillness. This was a woman who had endured worse. And this was a woman who knew how to survive. James Anderson pushed through the crowd, his expression darkening. Where Mabel wielded cruelty like a scalpel, precise and calculated, James preferred the blunt force approach. He stopped directly in front of Ebony's chair, towering over her, his shadow falling across her lap. "Did you hear my sister?" he demanded. "Or do we need to repeat it? You don't belong here." Ebony slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Jonathan wanted me here, for the reading of his will. That's why I came." James barked out a laugh. "Jonathan wanted you here? Jonathan's dead, Ebony. He doesn't want anything anymore. And whatever he might have said to you before he died, it doesn't matter. This family takes care of its own, and you were never family." "I was his wife," Ebony said softly. "You were a mistake," James shot back. "A lapse in judgment. Our brother was sick, weak, not thinking clearly in his final years. He let sentiment cloud his business sense, but we're here to fix that now." Mabel joined her brother, standing shoulder to shoulder with him in a united front. Together, they blocked Ebony's view of the rest of the room, creating a wall of hostility and disdain. "James is right," Mabel added, her tone saccharine sweet with false sympathy. "You must be so confused, poor thing. You probably thought you'd walk in here and we'd all treat you like the lady of the manor, but reality is often disappointing, isn't it?" The crowd was eating it up. Phones continued recording. Whispers intensified. This was better than any reality television show. This was real-life drama unfolding in real time among the city's elite. Christopher Wise Bolter, still standing at his position near the marble table, watched the scene with an expression that revealed nothing. His hands remained folded over the brown envelope. He made no move to intervene, though his eyes tracked every interaction with the precision of a chess player analyzing the board. He knew something that no one else in this room knew, except perhaps for the woman being humiliated in the corner. But timing was everything in law, and in life. So he waited. James turned abruptly toward the entrance, where two security guards stood at attention. They were large men in dark suits, hired specifically for estate security, and they'd been present earlier when James had shoved Ebony in the courtyard. "You two!" James called out, snapping his fingers. "Come here." The guards exchanged uncertain glances but obeyed, crossing the marble floor to stand before James. "I want this woman removed from the premises," James ordered, gesturing dismissively toward Ebony. "She's trespassing. She has no legal right to be here, and her presence is disturbing the other guests." One of the guards, a younger man with a nervous expression, cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, the lawyer specifically said—" "I don't care what the lawyer said," James interrupted. "I'm the head of this family now. This is our estate, and I'm telling you to remove her, now." The second guard, older and more experienced, looked past James toward Christopher I Bolter. "Mr. Bolter, what are your instructions, sir?" All eyes in the room turned to the lawyer. Christopher took his time responding. He adjusted his reading glasses, glanced down at the envelope in his hands, then looked up at the guards with an expression of measured calm. "Mrs. Anderson," he said carefully, emphasizing Ebony's married name, "was specifically named in the deceased's final instructions. She has every legal right to be present for this reading. In fact, her presence is required." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. "Required?" James's face flushed red with anger. "That's ridiculous! You're going to let protocol get in the way of common sense? Look at her! She's clearly out of place here. She's making everyone uncomfortable." "The law doesn't concern itself with comfort," Christopher replied evenly, "only with legal rights and documented wishes, and Mr. Jonathan Anderson's wishes were very clear." Mabel stepped forward, her composure beginning to crack. "This is absurd. We're his family, his blood. Whatever he left her could have been handled privately, quietly. There's no reason she needs to sit here and be part of this gathering." "On the contrary," Christopher said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "there is every reason. But you'll understand why once I've completed the formal reading. Until then, I must insist that Mrs. Anderson remain exactly where she is." Ebony felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but a tiny crack in the suffocating weight of humiliation she'd been carrying. Christopher hadn't just defended her legal right to stay. He'd used her married name. He'd acknowledged her as Jonathan's widow in front of everyone. It was the first time anyone besides Clara had shown her even a shred of respect since she'd arrived. James looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Christopher's expression stopped him. The lawyer had been with the Anderson family for over 20 years. He knew where all the bodies were buried, figuratively and perhaps literally. Crossing him would be unwise. "Fine," James spat. "Let her stay. Let her witness exactly how little she actually meant to this family." He stormed back toward the center of the room, Mabel following in his wake, both of them radiating barely contained fury. The security guards retreated to their posts, looking relieved to be out of the middle of family drama. And Ebony remained in her corner seat, handbag on her lap, breathing slowly and steadily. The crowd's energy had shifted. The outright mockery had dimmed slightly, replaced by curiosity and confusion. Why would Jonathan Anderson specifically require his widow's presence? What could possibly be in that envelope that made the lawyer defend her so firmly? Veronica Chen leaned toward her companion again, her voice now tinged with uncertainty. "Do you think, could he have left her something substantial?" "Doubtful," the gray-bearded man replied, though he sounded less confident than before. "Probably just a small trust, enough to keep her quiet and prevent any legal challenges. That's standard in these situations." "But the lawyer said her presence was required," Veronica pressed. "That's unusual, isn't it?" "Unusual, yes, but not unprecedented. We'll know soon enough." Across the room, Clara caught Ebony's eye and gave her the smallest nod of encouragement. The older woman had worked in this house long enough to know its secrets, and she'd spent enough time with Jonathan in his final months to understand that he'd been planning something that would shake the Anderson family to its core. Ebony didn't smile back. She couldn't manage it. But she held Clara's gaze for a moment, drawing strength from that small gesture of solidarity. Minutes ticked by. Christopher organized his papers with meticulous care, arranging them in a specific order on the marble table. He was in no rush. The longer the tension built, the more impact his words would have when he finally spoke them. James and Mabel whispered urgently to each other on the far side of the room, their body language tense and agitated. They kept glancing toward Ebony, then toward Christopher, trying to read the situation. The business associates had formed their own clusters, speculating quietly about the estate's valuation, the division of assets, the future of Anderson Enterprises. The extended family members, cousins, aunts, uncles who rarely saw each other outside of weddings and funerals, watched everything with the detached interest of people waiting for a show to begin. And through it all, Ebony sat. She thought about Jonathan, about the first time they'd met at that charity gala 5 years ago. She'd been working as an event coordinator, managing logistics behind the scenes, when he'd approached her to ask about the silent auction items. He'd been kind, genuinely interested in the cause, rather than just writing a check for the tax deduction. They'd talked for an hour that night, then another hour when he'd asked her to coffee the following week, then dinners, walks through the botanical gardens, quiet evenings at his penthouse apartment watching old films. He'd never tried to impress her with his wealth. In fact, he'd seemed almost embarrassed by it sometimes, as if he knew it created a barrier between himself and authentic human connection. "My family sees dollar signs when they look at me," he told her once, late at night, when they were lying together in comfortable silence. "You see me, just me. Do you know how rare that is?" She'd understood even then that his relationship with James and Mabel was complicated. They'd built the business together, yes, But somewhere along the way, it had stopped being about partnership and started being about control, about who had the most power, the most influence, the most say in every decision. Jonathan had grown tired of it. Tired of the constant jockeying for position, tired of watching his siblings prioritize profit over people, expansion over ethics. "When I'm gone," he'd said during one of his final conversations with her, his voice weak but determined, "they're going to try to erase you, to pretend you never mattered. But I've made sure that won't happen. Trust me, Ebony, and trust Christopher. He knows what to do." She'd held his hand and promised she would trust him, even though she hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now, sitting in this corner seat, enduring the whispers and the mockery and the casual cruelty of people who had never bothered to know her, she finally understood. This wasn't just about an inheritance. This was Jonathan's final act of love and protection. Christopher Forster Bolter cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention once more. "If everyone could please take their seats," he announced, "we'll begin the formal reading in exactly 5 minutes. I ask that all recording devices be turned off. This is a private legal proceeding, and any unauthorized recording or distribution of its contents will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Reluctantly, phones were pocketed. Guests began settling into chairs arranged in rows facing the marble table. James and Mabel positioned themselves in the front row, center seats, as if they were royalty about to receive their coronation. Ebony remained where she was, in her corner seat, separate from everyone else. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes briefly. "I trust you, Jonathan," she thought. "Whatever you've planned, whatever happens next, I trust you." When she opened her eyes, Christopher was looking directly at her, and for the first time since she'd walked through those mansion gates, she saw something in someone's expression that gave her hope. It was respect. The reading was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The 5 minutes Christopher had requested stretched like an eternity. Guests shuffled into their seats with the rustling of expensive fabrics and the clicking of designer heels against marble. Conversations dropped to hushed tones, not out of respect, but out of eager anticipation. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the official division of the Anderson Empire. Ebony remained in her corner seat, watching the orchestrated chaos unfold before her. She felt disconnected from it all, as if she were observing the scene through thick glass. The whispers still reached her ears, but they'd become background noise now, a constant hum of judgment and speculation that she'd learned to tune out. What she couldn't tune out was the ache in her chest, the grief that threatened to overwhelm her every time she looked at the empty space where Jonathan should have been standing. He should have been here, commanding the room with his quiet authority, protecting her from his siblings' cruelty with nothing more than a raised hand or a stern look. But he was gone, and she was alone. Or so she thought. A gentle hand touched her shoulder, and Ebony startled, looking up to find Clara Hayes standing beside her. The elderly housekeeper had appeared so quietly that Ebony hadn't heard her approach. Clara's weathered face bore the lines of 7 decades of life, some etched by laughter, others by sorrow, but her eyes held a warmth that Ebony hadn't seen in anyone else's gaze all afternoon. "Mrs. Anderson," Clara said softly, using Ebony's married name with deliberate emphasis, the way Christopher had. "May I sit with you for a moment?" Ebony nodded, unable to trust her voice. She shifted slightly to make room, and Clara lowered herself into the adjacent chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested every action. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. They simply sat together, 2 figures pushed to the margins while the powerful and privileged took center stage. Finally, Clara reached over and placed her hand over Ebony's, the one still clutching the handbag like a lifeline. "I've worked in this house for 32 years, Clara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen 3 generations of Andersons come and go. I watched James and Mabel grow up, spoiled, entitled children who became spoiled, entitled adults. And I watched Jonathan become a man who tried so hard to be different from them. Ebony's eyes burned with unshed tears. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. Not here, not now. When he brought you here for the first time, Clara continued, I knew you were different, not because of how you dressed or where you came from or what you had, but because of how you looked at him. You saw him, Mrs. Anderson, not his money, not his last name, just him. A tear escaped despite Ebony's best efforts, sliding down her cheek. Clara produced a clean handkerchief from her apron pocket and pressed it into Ebony's free hand. They're treating you terribly, Clara said, her voice taking on a harder edge. I've watched it all day, and it's made me ashamed. Ashamed that I work for this family. Ashamed that I've said nothing. You don't have to say anything, Ebony whispered. You have a job to protect. I understand. No. Clara's grip on her hand tightened. There are some things more important than a job. Dignity is one of them. Kindness is another. And truth is the most important of all. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping even lower, meant for Ebony's ears only. Don't leave, dear. No matter what they say. No matter how they treat you, don't leave. Just wait. The truth always comes. It might take time, it might hurt while you're waiting, but it always, always comes. Ebony turned to look at Clara fully, searching the older woman's face. You know something. It wasn't a question. Clara's lips curved into the smallest smile. I know that Mr. Jonathan was a smart man, smarter than his brother and sister ever gave him credit for, and I know that he loved you more than anything else in this world. That's all I need to know. Before Ebony could respond, Clara patted her hand once more and stood up. I should get back to work before someone notices I'm shirking my duties. But remember what I said. Wait. And trust. She walked away as quietly as she'd arrived, disappearing through the service entrance like a ghost. Ebony pressed the handkerchief to her eyes, absorbing Clara's words like rain on parched earth. For the first time since entering the mansion, she didn't feel completely alone. There was at least one person here who saw her as human, who acknowledged her pain and her right to be present. It was enough to strengthen her resolve. She straightened in her chair, adjusted her pink dress, and placed the handbag squarely on her lap. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it with dignity. For Jonathan, for herself, and for Clara, who had shown her that kindness still existed even in the cruelest of places. Across the room, James and Mabel had positioned themselves at the front, flanked by their closest allies and advisors. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their body language radiating confidence and anticipation. I'm taking the downtown properties, James was saying, loud enough that several nearby guests could hear. The commercial real estate portfolio alone is worth hundreds of millions. You can have the international holdings. Mabel shook her head, her expression calculating. The international holdings are too volatile right now. European markets are unpredictable. I want the tech investments, the startup portfolio Jonathan built over the last 5 years. That's where the real growth potential is. Fine, James conceded with a dismissive wave. But I'm keeping majority control of Anderson Enterprises. The flagship company stays with me. That's non-negotiable. We'll see what the will says, Mabel replied coolly. But yes, you've always been better with the operational side. I'm more interested in the venture capital arm anyway. They spoke about their late brother's empire the way someone might discuss dividing up leftover takeout. Casual, transactional, utterly devoid of emotion or grief. To them, Jonathan's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a business opportunity. A younger man sitting behind them, Richard Anderson, a cousin from the West Coast branch of the family, leaned forward. What about the estate itself? The mansion, the grounds? That's got to be worth at least $50 million on today's market. James glanced back at him with a predatory smile. We'll keep it for now. Use it for corporate entertaining, host client events. But eventually, yes, we'll probably sell. The maintenance costs alone are absurd. Jonathan loved this house, Richard said quietly. Jonathan loved a lot of impractical things, Mabel said dismissively. That doesn't mean we have to be burdened with them. Her eyes drifted toward Ebony in her corner seat. the implication crystal clear. The guests who overheard these conversations exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable with the siblings' naked greed. Others nodded approvingly. This was, after all, how business was done among the wealthy. Sentiment was a luxury that poor people indulged in. The rich had to be pragmatic. Veronica Chen, seated a few rows back, whispered to her companion, "They're not even trying to hide it. It's like they've already forgotten he's dead." "Or they're trying very hard not to think about it," her companion replied. "Grief makes people uncomfortable. Greed is much easier to process." James stood up and walked to where Christopher was still arranging his papers, positioning himself directly in the lawyer's line of sight. "Christopher," he said, his tone attempting friendliness, but landing somewhere closer to impatience. "How much longer? Some of us have board meetings to get to this evening. Let's move this along, shall we?" Christopher looked up, his expression neutral. "Legal proceedings cannot be rushed, James. There are protocols to follow, documents to verify. I'll begin when I'm ready, not a moment before." "I just don't see why we need all this ceremony," James pressed. "Can't you just tell us the basic distribution and we'll handle the details through our respective attorneys?" "No," Christopher said flatly. "Your brother's instructions were explicit. The will must be read in full, in the presence of all named parties, with proper witnesses present. That's how it will proceed." James's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "Of course. Whatever Jonathan wanted. We just want to honor his wishes." The lie was so transparent that several guests actually laughed quietly. Mabel joined her brother, looping her arm through his in a show of sibling solidarity. "We do appreciate all your years of service to this family, Christopher. Jonathan trusted you implicitly, and so do we. I'm sure whatever's in that envelope will reflect his desire to keep Anderson Enterprises strong and in the family." The emphasis on "in the family" was accompanied by another pointed look toward Ebony. Christopher's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been amusement or anticipation, or both. "Mrs. Anderson is family," he said simply. "She was legally married to Jonathan for 4 years. That makes her an Anderson by law and by right." Mabel's smile went brittle. "Of course. I meant the blood family. Those of us who built this empire alongside Jonathan." "Jonathan built this empire," Christopher corrected quietly. "The rest of you benefited from it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. James's face flushed red. "Now wait I think we're ready to begin," Christopher announced, raising his voice to carry across the entire hall. "If everyone would please take their seats and remain silent throughout the reading, we can proceed." The guests immediately complied. The promise of drama and revelation more compelling than any confrontation between James and the lawyer. James and Mabel returned to their front row seats, both of them vibrating with barely suppressed anger and impatience. They sat with their backs ramrod straight, hands folded in their laps, projecting an image of respectful attention that fooled no one. Christopher lifted the brown envelope, holding it up so everyone could see the wax seal, still unbroken, bearing the Anderson family crest. "This envelope was delivered to my office 6 months before Jonathan Anderson's death," Christopher began, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "It contains his last will and testament, executed in my presence and witnessed by 2 independent parties as required by law. The contents of this document represent his final, legally binding wishes regarding the distribution of his estate." He broke the seal. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent hall. The crack of wax, the rustle of heavy paper being removed from its envelope. Ebony's heart hammered in her chest. Her hands were trembling slightly, so she pressed them flat against her handbag to still them. This was it, the moment that would determine not just her financial future, but whether Jonathan's love and trust in her had been enough to protect her from the family that had always despised her. Clara's words echoed in her mind. "Don't leave. Just wait. The truth always comes." Christopher unfolded the document, multiple pages of legal text, and adjusted his reading glasses. "I, Jonathan Andrew Anderson," he read aloud, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. The standard legal language rolled on. Guests leaned forward. James and Mabel exchanged confident glances, and Ebony sat perfectly still, waiting for the truth to finally arrive. Christopher paused in his reading, looking up from the document to address the room. Before I continue with the specific bequests, I must read a personal statement from the deceased. Jonathan requested that this be shared with everyone present. James shifted impatiently in his seat. Mabel checked her watch with exaggerated obviousness. But before Christopher could continue, Mabel raised her hand as if she were in a classroom. "I'm sorry, Christopher, but I have to ask, is it really necessary for everyone to remain for this? Surely the peripheral parties could wait outside while family business is discussed." Her eyes cut directly to Ebony. Several guests turned to look at the woman in the corner, whispers immediately igniting like brush fire. Christopher's expression hardened. "Mrs. Anderson is not a peripheral party. She is named in this will and must be present for its reading." "Named for what?" James scoffed, standing abruptly. "A small stipend? A modest trust fund? We already know Jonathan was sentimental about her. Fine. Give her whatever token amount he set aside, and let the rest of us handle the real business of managing his empire." He turned to face the assembled guests, playing to the crowd. "Look, we all know the situation here. My brother married her during a vulnerable time in his life. He was lonely, getting older, and she was available, convenient. But that doesn't mean we have to pretend this was some grand love story." Gasps rippled through the room. Even by the Anderson family's standards of casual cruelty, this was breathtakingly vicious. Ebony felt the words hit her like physical blows. Her fingers tightened around her handbag until her knuckles went white. Mabel stood as well, emboldened by her brother's audacity. She walked slowly toward Ebony's corner, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. "I mean, let's be honest about what we're all seeing here," Mabel said, gesturing toward Ebony's pink dress. "That dress probably cost what, $50? Maybe $100 if she splurged at some discount store? Look at it, polyester, off the rack, completely inappropriate for an occasion like this." She turned back to the crowd, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's actually quite sad. She's so far out of her depth that she doesn't even understand how to dress for a formal estate reading. This is Anderson Enterprises we're talking about. Billions of dollars in assets, and she shows up looking like she's going to a budget brunch." Laughter erupted from several guests. Not everyone. Some looked distinctly uncomfortable, but enough to make Ebony's cheeks burn with humiliation. Veronica Chen leaned forward, emboldened by Mabel's performance. "I heard she didn't even have a proper career before marrying Jonathan. What was it? Event planning? Party coordination? Basically catering." "Exactly." Mabel pounced on this. "She was hired help who managed to snag the boss. It's the oldest story in the world, and now she thinks that gives her the right to sit among us, as if she belongs in these circles." James joined his sister, the two of them forming a wall of contempt between Ebony and the rest of the room. "You know what I think?" he said loudly. "I think she came here today hoping to beg, hoping we'd feel sorry for her and write her a check out of pity. Well, I've got news for you, Ebony. We're not running a charity." "James, Mabel." Christopher's voice cut through the mockery like a blade. "This is highly inappropriate. Mrs. Anderson has every right—" "Oh, save it, Christopher," Mabel interrupted. "We're simply stating facts, and the fact is, she doesn't belong in this hall with legitimate family members and business associates. It's unseemly." She turned to address the crowd once more. "I think we should move the official reading to the library, family members only. Ebony can wait out here in the foyer. We'll call her in if, and only if, there's something specific she needs to sign." Murmurs of agreement came from some corners of the room. Others remained silent, but their silence felt like complicity. Ebony sat frozen, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Christopher had said she was required to be present. Jonathan had specifically requested it. But now they were going to physically remove her from the reading? "That is not how this works," Christopher said firmly. "The law requires—" The law," James mocked. You hide behind procedure while common sense screams otherwise. Fine, she can stay in the building, but she doesn't need to be in the same room. That's our compromise. Before Christopher could protest further, James gestured to the security guards who had been standing near the entrance. Gentlemen, please escort Mrs. Rubin to the foyer. Make sure she's comfortable, but she is not to enter the main hall unless explicitly invited. The guards looked to Christopher for confirmation. The lawyer's expression was thunderous, but he was also a realist. He could cite law all day, but if the family and their guests chose to interpret the rules creatively, he would need to choose his battles carefully. This is being noted for the record, Christopher said coldly. Every action taken here today will be documented and may be subject to legal review. Duly noted, James said dismissively. Now can we please proceed? The guards approached Ebony's corner. The younger one looked apologetic. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to come with us. Ebony stood slowly, clutching her handbag to her chest like armor. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to walk with her head up, her shoulders back. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she walked across the marble floor toward the exit, Mabel's voice followed her. Oh, and Ebony, don't wander off. We might need you to sign some paperwork acknowledging your consolation prize. I'm sure Jonathan left you enough for a nice little apartment somewhere far away from here. Cruel laughter echoed through the hall. Ebony made it to the foyer before her composure finally cracked. The guards positioned themselves discreetly near the entrance to the main hall, giving her space while ensuring she didn't return. She sank onto a marble bench near the grand staircase, her handbag falling to her lap. Through the tall doors, she could hear muffled voices as the reading resumed without her. She'd been exiled from her own husband's will reading, cast out like she was nothing, like she'd never mattered at all. You matter to me, Jonathan's voice echoed in her memory. You're the only person in this world who matters to me. It had been a Sunday morning 3 years ago. They'd been in the garden behind the mansion, the one section of the estate that Jonathan considered truly his, where he grew vegetables and tended rose bushes like a common gardener instead of a billionaire CEO. Ebony had been helping him stake tomato plants when he'd suddenly stopped, turned to her, and spoken those words with such intensity that she dropped the twine she'd been holding. I know my family doesn't accept you, he'd continued, kneeling in the dirt beside her. I know they never will. They don't have the capacity to see what I see in you, your kindness, your strength, your absolutely unshakable integrity. But I see it. And I need you to know that no matter what happens, no matter what they say or do, you matter. You are valued. You are loved. She'd kissed him then, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Promise me something, he'd whispered against her hair. Promise me that if anything happens to me, you won't let them make you feel small. You are not small, you are extraordinary. And I've made sure— He'd stopped himself, shaking his head. Never mind. Just promise me you'll remember your worth. I promise, she'd said. But sitting on this cold marble bench, listening to the muffled sounds of his family dividing his empire without her, that promise felt impossible to keep. The foyer was empty except for her and the guards. Even the catering staff had moved into other areas of the mansion. She was completely, utterly alone. She opened her handbag with trembling fingers and pulled out the small photograph she'd tucked inside, a candid shot someone had taken at a charity event. Jonathan was laughing at something she'd said, his eyes crinkled with genuine joy, his hand reaching for hers. He'd been so alive in that moment, so present, so hers. Now he was gone, and she was surrounded by people who had spent 4 years waiting for exactly this, the chance to erase her from his life as if she'd never existed. Through the doors, she heard Mabel's voice rise in triumph. I knew it! The downtown portfolio goes to family holdings. That's exactly what we expected. More voices, congratulatory, pleased. They were getting everything they wanted. Ebony pressed the photograph against her chest and closed her eyes. Remember your worth, Jonathan had said. But how could she remember something that everyone around her was working so hard to destroy? Mrs. Anderson? Ebony looked up to find Clara standing at the base of the grand staircase, carrying a tray with a glass of water and what looked like shortbread cookies. "I thought you might need this," Clara said softly, setting the tray on the bench beside her. "You've been sitting here for 20 minutes and haven't had anything to drink all afternoon." "Thank you," Ebony whispered, her voice breaking. Clara sat down beside her, completely ignoring the security guards who shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene. The elderly housekeeper had been part of this family longer than either of them had been alive. They weren't about to tell her where she could or couldn't sit. "They sent you out here," Clara said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ebony nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Cruel," Clara said simply, "but not surprising. They've always been cruel. Jonathan tried to shield you from the worst of it when he was alive, but now I'm nothing," Ebony finished. "That's what Mabel said, that I'm worthless, that my dress is cheap and I don't belong here, and I probably came to beg for money." She looked down at her pink dress, seeing it through Mabel's contemptuous eyes. It wasn't designer, it wasn't expensive. But it was the dress Jonathan had once said he loved because the color makes you look like sunrise. She'd worn it today because it reminded her of him, because it made her feel close to him one last time. And they'd used it as another weapon against her. "Your dress is perfectly appropriate," Clara said firmly. "And even if it wasn't, that's not what matters. They're attacking you because they're afraid." Ebony looked at her in confusion. "Afraid? Of what? I have nothing. I am nothing to them." Clara's weathered hand covered hers. "Oh, my dear, you have no idea, do you?" "Idea about what?" Before Clara could answer, raised voices erupted from the main hall. Not angry voices, shocked voices, confused voices, and then, cutting through everything else, Mabel's scream, "What?" Clara's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "The truth," she said quietly. "It's finally arriving." Ebony rose from the marble bench, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Clara stood with her, the older woman's hand steadying her elbow as they moved toward the entrance of the main hall. The security guards stepped forward instinctively, but Clara fixed them with a look that could have frozen fire. "You will not stop her, not now." Whatever authority Clara held in this house, earned through 3 decades of loyal service, it was enough. The guards stepped aside. Ebony pushed through the tall oak doors. The scene inside was pure chaos. James stood at the front of the room, his face an alarming shade of red, one finger pointed accusingly at Christopher. "That's impossible! You're reading it wrong. Check the document again." Mabel had risen from her seat. Gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her carefully composed mask had shattered, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "There must be another page. A codicil. An amendment. Jonathan wouldn't. He couldn't." Christopher Poissy-Bolter stood behind the marble table like a judge presiding over a courtroom, the will held firmly in both hands. His expression was carved from stone, impassive, unshakable, absolutely certain. "I assure you," Christopher said, his voice cutting through the pandemonium with surgical precision, "I am reading exactly what is written, and I have read it correctly." The guests were in an uproar. Some had jumped to their feet, phones out despite Christopher's earlier ban on recording. Others sat frozen in shock, mouths hanging open. Veronica Chen looked like she might faint. The business associates were conferring urgently among themselves, already calculating the seismic shift this represented for Anderson Enterprises. Nobody had noticed Ebony slip back into the hall. Nobody except Christopher, whose eyes found hers across the crowded room. He gave her the smallest nod, an acknowledgement, an invitation. "Come forward," his expression said. "This is your moment." But Ebony couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the marble floor, because she still didn't fully understand what was happening. She'd heard Mabel's scream, seen the chaos, but the pieces hadn't clicked together yet. "Read it again," James demanded, his voice shaking. "Every word. Slowly. so we can all hear exactly what it says. As you wish. Christopher adjusted his reading glasses and lifted the document. His voice rang out clear and authoritative, each syllable deliberate. I, Jonathan Andrew Anderson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the following. To my beloved wife, Ebony J. Reuben Anderson, I leave all controlling shares of Anderson Enterprises, comprising 62% of total equity. To her also goes the Anderson family estate, including the main residence, all grounds and associated properties. Furthermore, all remaining assets, including but not limited to investment portfolios, real estate holdings, intellectual property rights, and business interests, are to be transferred to Ebony J. Reuben Anderson in their entirety, making her the sole heir and executor of my estate. The room seemed to tilt beneath Ebony's feet. Sole heir, controlling shares, the estate, everything. To my brother James and my sister Mabel, Christopher continued, his voice never wavering, I leave the following, $1 each to be paid from petty cash in recognition of their years of service to the company. Additionally, I leave them this message. You spent your lives measuring worth in dollar signs and power plays. Perhaps now you'll learn that the greatest wealth is found in how we treat those who cannot benefit us. Ebony taught me that. I pray she might teach you as well. Silence descended like a guillotine blade. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then James exploded. $1? His roar echoed off the crystal chandeliers. $1? I built this company with him. I spent 20 years of my life. You spent 20 years trying to control him, Christopher interrupted coldly. Your brother documented that very clearly in his personal letters to me. Letters that are also part of the legal file and can be submitted as evidence should anyone contest this will. Mabel's face had gone from pale to gray. This is fraud. She manipulated him, poisoned his mind against us. No one in their right mind would— Your brother was examined by 3 independent physicians in the 6 months before his death, Christopher said. All 3 certified him as being of completely sound mind. Those certifications are also on file, as is the video recording of Jonathan signing this will, during which he clearly and repeatedly states that he is acting of his own free will, without coercion or undue influence. He paused, letting that sink in. Video recording? Mabel whispered. Jonathan knew you would contest this. He took every possible precaution to ensure his wishes would be honored. Christopher's gaze swept across the room. This will is ironclad. It will stand up to any legal challenge you attempt to mount. And trust me, he anticipated every single argument you might make. James lurched toward Christopher, but several guests grabbed him, holding him back. She doesn't deserve this. She doesn't know anything about running a business. She'll destroy everything we built. Everything Jonathan built, Christopher corrected, and he clearly believed she was capable, more capable, apparently, than either of you. For the first time since the reading began, Christopher turned his full attention to Ebony, still standing near the entrance. Mrs. Anderson, he said formally, would you please join me at the front of the room? Every head swiveled toward her. The whispers started immediately. Different now, charged with shock and recalculation. That's the heir? The woman they kicked out? She owns everything now? Everything? Oh my God, James literally tried to have her thrown out of her own estate. Ebony's legs trembled as she began walking down the center aisle. It was the longest walk of her life, past guests who had mocked her minutes ago, past business associates who had called her a gold digger, past the empty front row seats where James and Mabel had sat so confidently before their world collapsed. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on Christopher, who watched her approach with something that might have been respect or pride. When she reached the front, he extended his hand. She took it, his grip firm and reassuring. Mrs. Anderson, he said quietly, meant only for her ears, your husband made me promise that I would protect his wishes and protect you. I intend to honor both promises. He turned back to the stunned assembly. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means, Christopher announced. As of this moment, Ebony J. Rubin Anderson is the majority shareholder of Anderson Enterprises. She controls all voting rights. She owns this estate. Every business decision, every property, every asset, all of it falls under her authority. He gestured toward James and Mabel, who looked like they'd been struck by lightning. James and Mabel Anderson hold no decision-making power. They own no shares. They have no claim to any property. According to Jonathan's explicit instructions, they are to be immediately removed from all executive positions within Anderson Enterprises. "You can't do this," James said, but his voice had lost its earlier fury. Now he just sounded hollow, destroyed. "We have contracts, employment agreements, which your brother ensured were drafted to allow for termination under specific circumstances," Christopher replied. "Circumstances that include behavior detrimental to the company's reputation and values. I would say today's conduct more than qualifies." Mabel finally found her voice, though it came out strangled. "Ebony, please, you have to understand, we were just upset, emotional. We didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Ebony said softly. It was the first time she'd spoken since entering the room, and her quiet voice somehow carried more weight than all of James's shouting. She looked at Mabel, really looked at her, seeing past the designer clothes and diamond jewelry to the desperate fear underneath. "You meant it when you called me worthless," Ebony continued. "When you mocked my dress, when you said I didn't belong here. You meant every word because you've always believed it. You've believed it since the day Jonathan introduced me to this family." Mabel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Ebony turned to James. "And you meant it when you said I was nothing without him. When you tried to kick me down those steps. When you ordered security to drag me out of my own husband's will reading." James couldn't meet her eyes. "The difference is," Ebony said, her voice growing stronger, "Jonathan never believed those things. He saw something in me that you couldn't see because you've spent your whole lives measuring people by what they own rather than who they are." She looked down at her pink dress, the one they'd called cheap, inappropriate, pathetic. "He loved this dress," she said quietly. "He said it reminded him of sunrise. He said that I brought light into his life after years of living in shadow. And you know what? He was right. Not because I'm special or extraordinary, but because I loved him for who he was, not what he had." The room was absolutely silent now. Every eye was on Ebony. This woman in her modest pink dress who had just inherited a billion-dollar empire. She turned to Christopher. "What happens now?" "Now," Christopher said, pulling out another set of documents. "You sign these papers officially accepting your inheritance and your position as majority shareholder and CEO of Anderson Enterprises, and then we discuss the terms of James and Mabel's departure from the company." "CEO?" Ebony's eyes widened. "Jonathan wanted me to run the company?" "He wanted you to have the choice," Christopher clarified. "You can appoint someone else to the position if you prefer, but the final decision is yours. Everything is yours." Ebony looked around the room, at the shocked faces, the calculating expressions, the few genuine smiles, including Clara's, visible in the doorway. This was power, real, absolute power, the kind of power that James and Mabel had wielded like weapons their entire lives. But Ebony didn't feel powerful. She felt terrified and sad, and overwhelmingly grateful that Jonathan had trusted her with this impossible responsibility. "Before I sign anything," she said slowly, "I need to ask, why? Why did Jonathan do this?" Christopher's expression softened. Because he knew what would happen if he left the company to them. He'd watched them become more ruthless, more focused on profit over people with every passing year. He believed they would destroy everything he'd tried to build, not through incompetence, but through sheer greed. He handed her a sealed envelope, smaller than the one containing the will. "He left this for you, personal, not part of the legal documents. He asked me to give it to you after the reading." Ebony's hands shook as she took it. Her name was written across the front in Jonathan's distinctive handwriting. She didn't open it. Not here. Not in front of everyone. But holding it, This final message from the man she'd loved gave her the strength to straighten her shoulders and meet Christopher's eyes. "Where do I sign?" Christopher laid out several documents on the marble table, each one bearing official seals and legal stamps. But before he could indicate where Ebony should sign, James lurched forward, his composure completely shattered. "That's impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a forgery. It has to be. Jonathan would never— he couldn't—" He grabbed for the will, but Christopher pulled it back smoothly, his expression hardening. "Touch these documents without authorization, and I'll have you removed by law enforcement, not just security," Christopher said coldly. "You are no longer a family member with access privileges, James. You are now, legally speaking, a hostile party to this estate." The words hit James like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through emotions so quickly it was almost grotesque. Rage, disbelief, grief, panic. Mabel pushed past her brother, her voice shrill. "She tricked him. Don't you see? She manipulated a dying man. She isolated him from his family, poisoned his mind against us, made him believe—" "Enough," Christopher said, his single word carrying the weight of decades of legal authority. "These accusations are not only false, they are actionable. Slander, defamation, and harassment of the primary beneficiary. Continue down this path, and Mrs. Anderson will have grounds to pursue legal action against both of you." "Let her try," Mabel spat, but her voice wavered. "We have lawyers, too." "The best lawyers money can buy. We'll fight this. We'll tie it up in court for years if we have to." "With what money?" Christopher asked simply. The question landed like a bomb in the middle of the room. Mabel's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. "You seem to have forgotten your current financial position," Christopher continued, his tone almost conversational now. "As of this moment, you have no income from Anderson Enterprises. No salary, no dividends, no access to company accounts. The trust funds your brother established for you years ago were dissolved 6 months before his death, at his request, and those funds were transferred into the estate's general assets." He paused, letting them absorb this. "Which means that any legal challenge you wish to mount will need to be funded personally. And given your lifestyle expenses over the past decade, I suspect your personal savings are not as substantial as you might hope." James's face had gone from red to ashen. "He froze us out. 6 months before he died, he was already—" "Planning for exactly this scenario," Christopher confirmed. "Yes, your brother knew you would contest the will. He prepared accordingly." Mabel's legs seemed to give out. She sank into the nearest chair, her pristine white suit suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume she was wearing to a party she'd never been invited to. "I want to see the documents," James said hoarsely. "All of them. The will, the medical certifications, everything. I have a right to see them." Christopher considered this for a moment, then nodded. "You do have a right to review the will, as mentioned parties." "Very well." He produced several copies, perfect duplicates of the original, and handed one set to James, another to Mabel. "These are certified copies," Christopher explained. "Examine them as closely as you like. You'll find every signature, every seal, every witness statement is completely legitimate." James snatched the documents with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the pages frantically, looking for something, anything, that might invalidate what he'd just heard. But with each page, his shoulders sagged a little more. Ebony watched him from where she stood beside Christopher. She'd expected to feel triumph in this moment. Vindication. Some surge of satisfaction at seeing her tormentors brought low. Instead, she felt hollow. Sad. This wasn't victory. It was the death of a family that had been broken long before Jonathan passed away. Mabel was reading her copy too, her manicured finger trailing down the legal text, pausing at each signature. Jonathan's signature, the witnesses' signatures, the notary's seal, the date, 6 months before his death, just as Christopher had said. All valid, all legitimate, all completely, devastatingly real. "He really did this," Mabel whispered. "He really left us nothing." "He left you each $1, Christopher corrected. "And a message. Perhaps you should consider why." Around them, the assembled guests were processing what they'd witnessed. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable, like air pressure changing before a storm. Veronica Chen, who had laughed at Ebony's dress less than an hour ago, now stared at her with wide eyes. The dismissive contempt had evaporated, replaced by something between fear and desperate calculation. "She owns everything," Veronica whispered to her companion. "The company, the estate, the investment portfolio. Do you know what that's worth?" "Billions," her companion replied, his voice hushed with awe. "Jonathan Anderson was worth at least $3 billion, maybe more, and she gets all of it." The business associates who had called Ebony a gold digger were conferring urgently among themselves. Their entire strategy for positioning themselves within Anderson Enterprises had just collapsed. The power structure they'd spent years navigating no longer existed. A younger executive, Marcus Chen, no relation to Veronica, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his tone carefully respectful, "I just want to say that I had the pleasure of working with your late husband on several projects. He was a visionary leader, and I'm certain he chose you for very good reasons." It was a transparent attempt to curry favor, but at least it was polite. Others began to follow his lead, sensing which way the wind was blowing. "Mrs. Anderson, if you need any guidance on the tech portfolio, Mrs. Anderson, I'd be happy to brief you on the international holdings. Mrs. Anderson, perhaps we could schedule a meeting to discuss—" "Stop!" Ebony's quiet voice cut through the sudden chorus of offers. Everyone fell silent. She looked around the room at all these people who had mocked her, dismissed her, called her worthless. Now they were tripping over themselves to be useful to her. The transformation was obscene in its speed. "I appreciate your offers," Ebony said carefully, "but right now I need a moment to process what's happening." "Christopher, may we continue the signing?" "Of course." Christopher gestured to the documents laid out on the table. Ebony stepped forward, but before she could pick up the pen, a voice stopped her. "Wait!" It was James. He still held his copy of the will, but he'd stopped reading. Now he was staring at Ebony with an expression she couldn't quite parse. Not anger anymore, but something more complex. Something that might have been understanding dawning far too late. "You knew," James said slowly. "Didn't you? You knew what was in the will before you came here today." "No," Ebony said truthfully. "I knew Jonathan had made arrangements. He told me I would be taken care of but I didn't know the specifics until Christopher read them aloud just now." "You didn't know you were inheriting billions of dollars?" "I didn't know I was inheriting anything," Ebony said. "I came here because Jonathan asked me to, because Christopher sent me a formal notice requesting my presence. That's all." James laughed, a broken, hollow sound. Of course you didn't know. That's exactly why he chose you, isn't it? Because you would have come even if he'd left you nothing. You would have shown up, endured our cruelty, sat through the entire reading, all of it, just because he asked you to." Ebony didn't respond. There was nothing to say. "That's what he was trying to teach us," James continued, more to himself than anyone else, "with that message in the will, about measuring worth, about how we treated people who couldn't benefit us." He looked at his sister, still sitting in stunned silence. "We failed, Mabel. We failed every single test he set for us." Mabel's eyes were glazed, unfocused. 35 years, she whispered. "I spent 35 years building this company alongside him, and he gave it all to someone he'd known for 4 years." "Maybe that should tell you something." Clara's voice came from the doorway. The elderly housekeeper stepped into the hall, her presence commanding despite her simple uniform. She'd shed her servant's deference and now stood like a witness preparing to deliver testimony. "I've worked in this house for 32 years, Clara said, addressing the room. "I watched you grow up, both of you. I watched you become exactly the kind of people Jonathan spent his whole life trying not to be." "Clara," James started. "No," Clara said firmly. "You've talked enough today. Now you're going to listen. Jonathan loved you, both of you, but he couldn't trust you, not with his legacy, not with everything he'd built, because he knew, we all knew, that you would strip it down to profit margins and quarterly reports. You would fire employees to boost earnings, cut corners to increase dividends, destroy anything that didn't serve your immediate financial interests. She walked slowly toward Ebony, her weathered hand finding the younger woman's shoulder. "But her?" Clara said softly. "She spent 4 years getting to know every person who worked in this house. She learned our names, our children's names, our stories. She fought with Jonathan about worker benefits and fair wages. She convinced him to establish the Employee Education Fund that you both voted against in the board meeting." James flinched at this. Even Mabel's eyes focused slightly, recognition flickering. "She wasn't trying to inherit anything," Clara continued. "She was trying to make sure that if something happened to Jonathan, the people who depended on him would be protected. That's who she is. That's why he chose her." The room had gone completely silent again, but this silence was different from before. Not shock or scandal, but something approaching understanding. Ebony felt tears pricking at her eyes. She'd never heard Clara speak like this, never realized the older woman had been watching so closely, understanding so much. "Thank you," Ebony whispered. Clara squeezed her shoulder once more, then stepped back. Christopher cleared his throat. "Mrs. Anderson, whenever you're ready." Ebony picked up the pen, a beautiful fountain pen that Christopher had brought specifically for this purpose. Her hand was steadier than she'd expected. She looked down at the signature line. Above it, typed in formal legal text, "Ebony J. Reuben Anderson, primary beneficiary and sole heir." One signature would change everything. She glanced up, her eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd one final time. They were all watching her, some with hope, some with fear, some with the neutral expressions of people trying not to reveal what they were thinking. James and Mabel sat slumped in their chairs, defeated and diminished. They looked smaller somehow, as if the revelation had physically shrunk them. Ebony thought about the woman who had walked through the mansion gates hours ago, humiliated, grieving, uncertain. That woman had clutched her handbag like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart, but she wasn't that woman anymore. Or rather, she was still that woman, but she was also something more now. She was the keeper of Jonathan's legacy, the guardian of his values, the person he had trusted with everything he'd built. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. But she would not, could not, let him down. Ebony placed the pen on the paper and signed her name in clear, deliberate script. The scratch of ink on paper was the only sound in the entire hall. When she finished, she looked up at Christopher. "What happens now?" Christopher's expression softened with something that might have been pride. "Now? Now you decide what kind of leader you want to be." He gathered the signed documents, placed them carefully in his briefcase, and straightened. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the room, "I present to you Ebony J. Reuben Anderson, majority shareholder, primary decision-maker, and rightful heir to the Anderson estate." Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. The moment spoke for itself. The broke wife they'd mocked now controlled everything they'd wanted, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, they could do about it. Christopher closed his briefcase with a decisive click that echoed through the silent hall. He turned to face the assembled guests, his expression grave and formal, every inch the veteran attorney who had navigated countless high-stakes legal battles. "There is one more matter that must be addressed," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable judgment. "According to the explicit instructions left by Jonathan A. Anderson, and in accordance with the authority now vested in Mrs. Ebony J. Reuben Anderson as majority shareholder and primary decision-maker, I must make the following announcement." He paused, letting the tension build. James's head snapped up. Mabel's eyes widened with fresh panic. They knew what was coming. "Effective immediately," Christopher declared, "James L. Anderson and Mabel R. Anderson are hereby removed from all managerial roles, executive positions, and board memberships within Anderson Enterprises and all associated holdings." The words landed like hammer blows. "Furthermore," Christopher continued, Their access to all company facilities, accounts, and resources is revoked. Their company credentials, keys, and equipment must be surrendered before they leave these premises. Any attempt to access company systems or properties after this moment will be treated as corporate espionage and prosecuted accordingly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even those who had anticipated something dramatic hadn't expected such complete and immediate severance. James shot to his feet, the chair he'd been sitting in clattering backward. "You can't do this. I have contracts, legal protections, employment agreements that guarantee—" "That guarantee your position unless terminated for cause," Christopher interrupted smoothly. "Your conduct today, the public harassment of the majority shareholder, the attempted removal of a legal beneficiary from official proceedings, the baseless accusations of fraud and manipulation, all of this constitutes more than sufficient cause for immediate termination." He pulled another document from his briefcase. Additionally, Jonathan's will contains a specific clause addressing potential misconduct by former executives. He anticipated that you might react poorly to his final wishes. He was, unfortunately, entirely correct. Mabel stood, her composure cracking into something wild and desperate. "Christopher, please, please, you've known us for 20 years. You know we would never. We were just upset, emotional. Surely we can work something out. A probation period, a formal apology, something—" "I do know you, Mabel," Christopher said, his tone not unkind but utterly inflexible. "I've known you for 20 years, as you said. Which is precisely why I agreed with Jonathan's decision. This isn't about today's behavior, though that certainly confirms his judgment. This is about a pattern of conduct spanning decades." He gestured to Ebony, who stood silently beside him, her hands folded in front of her. 3 weeks after Jonathan introduced Ebony to the family, you attempted to have her investigated by a private detective. You were looking for anything, scandals, debts, criminal history, that you could use to discredit her. Mabel's face went white. 6 months later, Christopher continued, when Jonathan announced their engagement, you tried to convince him to require a prenuptial agreement that would have left Ebony with nothing in the event of divorce or his death. When he refused, you attempted to go behind his back to change his existing will. James opened his mouth to protest, but Christopher cut him off with a raised hand. "I stopped you, of course, but Jonathan knew. He knew about all of it. The investigations, the manipulation attempts, the way you systematically excluded Ebony from family gatherings and business events. He documented everything, and he made his decision based not on a moment of weakness or manipulation, but on years of watching you reveal exactly who you are." The hall was silent, except for Mabel's ragged breathing. "So no," Christopher said quietly. "There will be no probation period, no second chances. Jonathan's instructions were explicit, and Mrs. Anderson, as is her right, has chosen to honor those instructions in full." James's face twisted with rage. "This is bullshit! Complete bullshit! He's been dead for barely a week, and you're already executing some vendetta." "This isn't a vendetta," Ebony said. Her voice was quiet, but something in it commanded attention. Everyone turned to look at her. This woman in her pink dress, who had been kicked, mocked, and humiliated just hours ago. She took a step forward, moving out from behind Christopher's protective presence to stand on her own. "This isn't revenge," Ebony continued, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "This is consequence. There's a difference." She looked directly at James, then at Mabel, holding their gazes without flinching. "You called me worthless," she said simply. "Do you remember that? It was less than 2 hours ago, right outside this very hall. You said I was nothing without Jonathan, that I was a gold digger, a charity case, someone who didn't belong among you." Mabel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You mocked my dress," Ebony continued, her voice gaining strength. "Said it was cheap, inappropriate, that I looked like I was going to a budget brunch. You made sure everyone heard you. You wanted to humiliate me publicly, to make me feel as small as you believed I was." She took another step forward. "And when even that wasn't enough, you tried to have me physically removed from my own husband's will reading. You ordered security to drag me out. You made me sit in the foyer like a servant while you divided up everything Jonathan had built, assuming I'd walk away with nothing." Her eyes swept across the assembled guests. All the people who had laughed, whispered, recorded her humiliation on their phones. They saw. "You thought I had nothing," Ebony said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. "You thought I was powerless, broken, someone you could dismiss and destroy without consequence." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But Jonathan knew something you didn't. He knew that real worth isn't measured in designer clothes or family names or how well you play power games. It's measured in how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them, in kindness when it's inconvenient, in integrity when it's costly." James made a strangled sound, but Ebony continued, her gaze unwavering. "He trusted me with everything he built, not because I manipulated him, not because I isolated him from you, but because he knew I would protect what he valued most, not the money, not the properties, but the people. The employees who depend on this company for their livelihoods, the values he spent his life trying to uphold, even when you fought him every step of the way." She turned to look at the crowd, her voice strengthening further. "Today, you learn what dignity looks like, what justice looks like. It's not me gloating over your downfall or enjoying your pain. It's me standing here after everything you put me through and still choosing to honor my husband's wishes rather than my own anger." Mabel took a stumbling step toward her, tears streaming down her face. "Ebony, please, please, we can fix this. We can learn. We can be better. Just give us a chance." "I gave you a chance," Ebony said quietly. "Every day for 4 years, I gave you chances. Every family dinner where you excluded me. Every business event where you introduced me as Jonathan's wife, but never by name. Every subtle insult and deliberate slight. I gave you chances to see me as a person, to accept that your brother had chosen me, not as a trophy or a convenience, but as a partner." She shook her head slowly. "You never took those chances, and now the choice is no longer yours to make." She turned to Christopher. "Proceed with the removal." Christopher nodded and gestured to the security guards who had been standing near the entrance. The same 2 guards who had escorted Ebony to the foyer earlier now approached James and Mabel with expressions of grim determination. The younger guard, the one who had looked apologetic when removing Ebony, now showed no such hesitation. "Mr. Anderson, Ms. Anderson, I need you to come with us." "Don't you dare touch me," James snarled, backing away. "I'll have your jobs. I'll have all your jobs. Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir," the older guard said calmly. "You're the man we're escorting off the property. Now you can walk out with dignity, or we can make this more difficult. Your choice." James looked around wildly, seeking allies, finding none. The business associates who had once courted his favor now avoided his eyes. The family members who had laughed at his jokes about Ebony now studied the marble floor with sudden fascination. He was alone. They both were. "This isn't over," James said, his voice shaking. "We'll fight this. We'll take it to court. We'll expose everything." "Please do," Christopher said mildly. "I have 47 boxes of documentation ready for discovery. Video recordings, audio transcripts, witness statements, financial records showing every questionable decision you've made over the past decade. Please, by all means, let's air everything in open court. I'm quite confident about how that will turn out." James's face crumpled. For just a moment, the rage and arrogance fell away, revealing something raw and broken underneath. He looked at Ebony with an expression that might have been understanding or regret, or simply the dawning realization of how completely he had destroyed himself. "He really did love you," James said quietly. "I know," Ebony replied. "And you really loved him. More than anything." James nodded slowly, something in him finally, devastatingly accepting the truth. "Then I suppose he chose well." He turned to the guards. "I'll walk. No need for dramatics." Mabel, however, had collapsed to her knees, her designer suit crumpling, her perfect makeup streaking with tears. "Please," she sobbed. "Please, Ebony. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything." "Stand up, Mabel," Ebony said, not harshly but firmly. Stand up and walk out of here with whatever dignity you have left. That's the kindest thing I can offer you right now." For a long moment, Mabel didn't move. Then Clara appeared beside her, offering a hand. The elderly housekeeper, who had served this family for 3 decades, helped Mabel to her feet with surprising gentleness. "Come on, dear," Clara said quietly. "It's time to go." Mabel leaned on Clara as if the older woman were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Together, with the guards flanking them, James and Mabel walked toward the exit. Every step was watched by dozens of eyes, every stumble noted, every tear seen. The same crowd that had laughed when they kicked Ebony now watched in absolute silence as they were escorted out of the mansion they'd once considered their own. It was the definition of poetic justice. At the doorway, James paused and looked back one final time. His eyes found Ebony's across the crowded hall. "Take care of it," he said simply. "Take care of what he built." "I will," Ebony promised. And then they were gone. The massive oak doors closed behind them with a hollow finality that seemed to echo through the entire estate. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The assembled guests seemed frozen, uncertain how to process what they'd just witnessed. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone began to clap. It was Marcus Chen, the young executive who had been one of the first to switch his allegiance. His applause was tentative at first, almost questioning, but then others joined in. Clara, standing near the door, clapped with fierce pride. A few of the business associates, calculating the new political landscape, added their applause. Some of the family members, those who had never particularly liked James and Mabel, clapped with what seemed like genuine relief. Not everyone participated. Veronica Chen kept her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Several others simply stared, too shocked to respond. But the applause grew, filling the hall with a sound that was part congratulation, part acknowledgement, part something deeper, recognition that they had just witnessed a seismic shift in power, and they needed to align themselves with the new order. Ebony stood at the center of it all, overwhelmed and exhausted, and still clutching the sealed envelope Christopher had given her, Jonathan's final personal message. She raised a hand, and the applause died away. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But this isn't a celebration. A family just broke apart. Whatever their faults, James and Mabel were Jonathan's brother and sister. He loved them, even if he couldn't trust them. So there's nothing to celebrate here, only resolution." She took a deep breath. "What I will promise you is this. Anderson Enterprises will continue to operate according to the principles Jonathan established. We will treat our employees fairly. We will honor our commitments. We will measure success not just in profit margins, but in positive impact. And we will never, ever judge anyone's worth by their appearance, their background, or their social status." Her eyes swept across the crowd, holding each gaze she met. "That includes all of you. What happened here today, the mockery, the cruelty, the casual dismissal of someone you thought was beneath you, it ends now. If you want to remain part of this company, part of this community, you will learn to treat people with basic human dignity, regardless of what they can do for you." The hall was absolutely silent. "Those who can't accept that are welcome to tender their resignations," Ebony continued. "I won't force anyone to stay, but I also won't tolerate the culture of cruelty that allowed today to happen in the first place." She turned to Christopher. "I think that's enough for today. Can we schedule a proper meeting for tomorrow? There's much to discuss, and I need some time." "Of course," Christopher said gently. "I'll have my office send over the necessary briefing materials. For now, you should rest. It's been an extraordinarily difficult day." Ebony nodded gratefully. As the guests began to file out, some casting final glances at her, others whispering urgently among themselves, Clara approached once more. "You did well," the elderly housekeeper said quietly. "Mr. Jonathan would be very proud." "I hope so," Ebony whispered. "God, I hope so. Because I have no idea what I'm doing, Clara. I don't know how to run a billion-dollar company. I don't know how to—" "You'll learn," Clara said firmly. "Just like you've learned everything else, one day at a time, with integrity and kindness guiding you. That's all anyone can do." Ebony hugged her, this woman who had been the only light in a very dark day, and let herself be held for a moment like a child seeking comfort. When they finally pulled apart, the hall was empty, except for Clara, Christopher, and a few remaining staff members beginning to clean up. Ebony looked down at the envelope in her hands. Jonathan's final message, the thing she'd been afraid to open in front of everyone. "I'm going to the garden," she said quietly. "The one Jonathan loved. I need to read this alone." Clara nodded, understanding. "I'll make sure no one disturbs you." Ebony walked through the empty mansion, her footsteps echoing on marble floors, past portraits of Anderson ancestors who stared down with painted eyes that had witnessed generations of family drama. She pushed open the door to the garden, Jonathan's sanctuary, where he'd grown tomatoes and tended roses, and stepped into the fading afternoon light. The envelope trembled in her hands as she finally, carefully, broke the seal. Inside was a single page, covered in Jonathan's handwriting. And as Ebony began to read, tears streaming down her face, she understood at last why he had done all of this. Not to punish his siblings, not to reward her, but to protect the one thing he valued above all else, the possibility that love and kindness might prevail over greed and cruelty. Even in death, he was still protecting her, still believing in her, still loving her with everything he had. Ebony sat on the weathered wooden bench in Jonathan's garden, surrounded by the roses he'd planted with his own hands. The letter lay open in her lap, the ink slightly smudged now from her tears. She'd read it 3 times already, each word sinking deeper into her heart. "My dearest Ebony, if you're reading this, then everything has unfolded exactly as I knew it would. You've endured their cruelty. You've survived their judgment. And now you understand why I had to do things this way. I could have told you about the will while I was alive, but I needed you to face them without that knowledge. Not because I wanted you to suffer. God, the thought of it breaks my heart. But because I needed them to reveal themselves completely. I needed witnesses, documentation, irrefutable proof of who they've become. More importantly, I needed you to see your own strength. You've always underestimated yourself, my love. You think your worth comes from being kind, being patient, being the person who smooths over conflicts and makes others comfortable. But your real power, the thing that made me fall in love with you, is that you never compromise your integrity, even when it costs you everything. Today, they tried to break you, and you stood firm. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. Now comes the hard part, figuring out what to do with everything I've left you. You're probably terrified, probably wondering if you can do this. Let me save you the suspense. You can. Not because you know business strategy or corporate finance, though you'll learn, but because you understand something James and Mabel never did, that a company is made of people, not profit margins. Trust yourself. Trust Christopher. And know that I'm prouder of you than I ever got the chance to say. All my love, always. Jonathan P.S. The roses need deadheading every Tuesday. Please don't let them die. They were my way of staying grounded when everything else felt like quicksand. Ebony folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest as she looked around the garden. It was overgrown now. Jonathan had been too sick in his final months to maintain it properly. Weeds pushed through the mulch. The roses showed signs of neglect, though some still bloomed stubbornly. "I won't let them die," she whispered to the empty air, to Jonathan's memory, to herself. Any of it. Not the roses, not the company, not the people who depend on us. I promise. She stood, tucking the letter carefully into her handbag, the same handbag she'd clutched throughout the entire ordeal. It felt heavier now, weighted with responsibility and grief, and something that might eventually become hope. When she walked back into the mansion, she found the main hall transformed. The chairs had been cleared away, the formal arrangement dismantled. Staff members moved efficiently through the space, restoring it to its normal state as if the afternoon's drama had been nothing more than a theatrical performance. But the evidence remained in the whispered conversations happening in corners, the sidelong glances cast her way, the palpable shift in atmosphere. Near the entrance, a small cluster of guests, who hadn't yet left, were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Ebony paused in the doorway, unnoticed, and listened. "I completely misjudged her," Marcus Chen was saying, his voice carrying a note of genuine amazement. "I actually called her a gold digger to Henderson last week. God, I feel like an ass." "We all misjudged her," Veronica Chen replied, though her tone was harder to read, somewhere between respect and resentment. Jonathan knew exactly what he was doing. "She's stronger than any of us thought." "Stronger than James and Mabel combined," an older man, Robert Harrison, one of the senior board members, added. "Did you see how she handled them? No gloating, no cruelty, just consequences, delivered with more grace than they ever showed anyone." "She's the rightful heir," Marcus said firmly. "Not because of the will, but because she actually embodies what Jonathan Anderson stood for. The rest of us have just been playing at it." "The question is," Veronica said slowly, "can she actually run the company? Inheriting it is one thing. Managing billions in assets, navigating board politics, making strategic decisions, that's entirely different." "She'll have help," Robert said. "Christopher will guide her. The executive team is solid, even with James gone. And honestly, maybe fresh perspective is exactly what Anderson Enterprises needs. James was brilliant, but he was also cutthroat. He'd sacrifice anything for quarterly earnings. And now she gets to decide if we keep our positions," Marcus said quietly, "after what we all said about her today, after how we treated her." A heavy silence fell over the group. Ebony stepped forward, letting her presence be known. All three of them turned, faces registering shock and something close to fear. "Mrs. Anderson," Marcus said quickly, straightening, "we didn't realize you were—" "I know what you said about me," Ebony interrupted gently. "Last week, today, probably in dozens of conversations I wasn't present for, and you're right to be worried about your positions." Veronica's face went pale. "But," Ebony continued, "I'm not interested in punishing people for honest mistakes or private opinions. What I care about is how you move forward, whether you can treat people, all people, regardless of their position or perceived status, with basic respect and dignity." She looked directly at Marcus. "You called me a gold digger. I won't forget that, but I also won't hold it against you forever if you prove that you've learned something from today. Can you do that?" Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. I promise you." "Don't promise me," Ebony said. "Promise yourself. Be better. That's all I'm asking." She turned to Veronica, whose defensive posture hadn't softened. "You're uncertain about whether I can run this company. That's fair. I'm uncertain too. But doubt isn't the same as sabotage. If you have concerns, bring them to me directly. If you have expertise to offer, I'll listen. What I won't tolerate is undermining or manipulation. Are we clear?" Veronica studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Crystal clear." "Good." Ebony managed a small smile. "Now, I believe you all have homes to get to. It's been an extraordinarily long day." As they filed out, Robert Harrison paused beside her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "Jonathan made the right choice. I didn't see it before, but I see it now." "Thank you," Ebony said.
"That means more than you know." When they were gone, she found herself alone in the vast entrance hall. The afternoon had faded into evening, golden light streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Clara emerged from one of the side corridors, carrying a tray with tea and what looked like sandwiches. "I thought you might be hungry," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on a side table. "You haven't eaten since this morning." "You're right, I haven't." Ebony realized with surprise that she was starving. Grief and adrenaline had suppressed her appetite until now. "Thank you, Clara, for everything. You've been—" She trailed off, not sure how to adequately express what Clara's kindness had meant during the darkest moments of the day. "Family takes care of family," Clara said simply. "And you've been more family to this house than those two ever were." "Where did they go?" Ebony asked. "James and Mabel, after the guards escorted them out." "James got into his car and drove off immediately. Mabel—" Clara hesitated. "Mabel sat in the driveway for 20 minutes crying. Eventually, her driver took her home. She left her phone behind. One of the staff found it on the courtyard steps." Ebony felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "Make sure it's returned to her. And Clara, if either of them tries to contact the house to speak with me, don't turn them away. I'm not saying I'll see them immediately, but I won't shut the door completely either." Clara's weathered face softened with approval. "You're a better person than I am, Mrs. Anderson. Most people would want nothing to do with them after today." "Most people haven't read Jonathan's letter," Ebony said quietly. She pulled it from her handbag, showing Clara the folded page. "He didn't do this to destroy them. He did it to protect what he built, yes, but also, I think he hoped it might teach them something, that maybe hitting bottom might be the only way they'd learn to be better people. And if they don't learn, then at least I tried." Ebony took a sandwich from the tray, suddenly ravenous. "That's all any of us can do, right? Try to be better than our worst impulses?" Clara smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "Mr. Jonathan used to say something similar, usually while he was elbow-deep in garden soil, complaining about aphids on his roses." They both laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the grand space, breaking some of the day's oppressive tension. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "With the house, I mean, and the staff. There are 12 of us in total, housekeepers, groundskeepers, kitchen staff. We've all been wondering—" "Nothing changes for the staff," Ebony said firmly. "Actually, that's not true. Things will change, but for the better. I want to review everyone's contracts, make sure you're all being paid fairly. Jonathan mentioned that James had blocked some of his initiatives for employee benefits." "The healthcare expansion," Clara confirmed. "Mr. Jonathan wanted to extend full coverage to part-time staff and add mental health benefits. James said it was too expensive, would set a problematic precedent." Ebony felt anger flash hot in her chest. "That gets implemented immediately. Can you get me a list of all the staff members, their positions, and current benefits? I want to review it this week." Clara's eyes gleamed with something that looked like vindication. "I can have that for you by tomorrow morning." "Perfect." Ebony took another bite of sandwich, her mind already racing ahead to the hundreds of decisions that would need to be made. "And Clara, I'll need your help with something else, something important. Anything. I need to learn this house, really learn it, not as a guest who visited occasionally, but as someone who lives here. Every room, every system, every person who keeps it running. Jonathan loved this place, but he never really explained it to me. Can you teach me?" Clara's expression softened with emotion. "It would be my honor." They sat together in companionable silence for a while, Ebony eating her modest meal in what was technically now her mansion, while Clara's presence provided an anchor of normalcy in a day that had been anything but normal. Eventually, Christopher appeared in the doorway, his briefcase in hand. "I'm heading back to the office," he said, "but I wanted to check on you first. How are you holding up?" "Honestly, I have no idea." Ebony set down her teacup. "I keep waiting to feel something, triumphant or vindicated or even just relieved. But mostly, I just feel tired and sad and overwhelmed." "That's normal," Christopher assured her. "You've been through a trauma today. Make no mistake about that. What they put you through was cruel and calculated. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel." "Jonathan's letter said I'd be terrified about running the company." "He was right." She looked up at the lawyer who had been her husband's most trusted advisor. "Christopher, I don't know anything about corporate finance or business strategy or—" "Stop," Christopher said gently. "Stop letting fear tell you who you are. Jonathan didn't leave you this company because he thought you were already an expert. He left it to you because he trusted your judgment, your values, and your capacity to learn. He sat down across from her, setting his briefcase aside. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll meet at my office. I'll introduce you to the key executives who will help you understand the business operations. We'll review the financial statements together, slowly, until you understand what you're looking at. We'll develop a transition plan that doesn't require you to make major decisions until you're ready." "And if I'm never ready?" "Then you hire a CEO to run the day-to-day operations while you maintain oversight as board chair." "But Ebony?" He leaned forward, his expression intense. "I think you'll surprise yourself. I think you're more prepared for this than you realize." "Why?" she asked. "What makes you so confident?" "Because in the 4 years I've known you, I've watched you ask Jonathan questions that made him rethink strategies he'd been pursuing for years. You challenged him, kindly, thoughtfully, on labor practices, environmental impacts, community investments. You didn't have an MBA, but you had something more valuable. You gave a damn about whether the company's success came at someone else's expense." Christopher stood, collecting his briefcase. "That's the kind of leadership Anderson Enterprises needs. Not someone who can squeeze out another percentage point of profit margin, but someone who can ask, at what cost, and actually care about the answer." After he left, Ebony sat alone in the dimming light, processing everything that had happened. The cruelty and the kindness, the public humiliation and the private vindication, the terrifying responsibility and the possibility, however distant, that she might actually be capable of carrying it. She thought about James and Mabel, wherever they were now, probably still reeling from how completely their world had collapsed in a single afternoon. She should hate them. After everything they'd done, hatred would be justified. But she couldn't quite manage it. What she felt instead was something closer to pity. Because they'd spent their entire lives building their identities around power and status and control, and in one afternoon it had all been revealed as sand castles before the tide. "Arrogance and cruelty collapse under the weight of truth," she murmured, remembering something Jonathan had once said. "The only question is whether people learn from the collapse or just start building the same structures somewhere else." Which would James and Mabel choose? She didn't know, but she hoped, for their sake, for Jonathan's memory, for her own peace of mind, that they might find a way to become better versions of themselves, even if they never acknowledged what they'd lost, even if they spent the rest of their lives resenting her. She hoped they might eventually understand what Jonathan had tried to teach them, that worth isn't found in what you have, but in how you treat people when you have the power to hurt them and choose kindness instead. Clara reappeared with a fresh pot of tea. "Mrs. Anderson, I've prepared the master suite for you. I took the liberty of moving some of your personal items from storage. I hope that's all right." "The master suite?" Ebony blinked. "Clara, I can't. That's where that's where you belong," Clara said firmly. "This is your home now, all of it. And Mr. Jonathan would want you to claim your space rather than hiding in guest rooms." Ebony felt tears prick her eyes again. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" 32 years of practice, Clara said with a small smile. "Now come on, you need rest." Tomorrow is going to be another very long day. As Ebony climbed the grand staircase, no longer as a visitor, but as the lady of the house, she carried Jonathan's letter pressed against her heart. The day had been brutal, humiliating, transformative, but she had survived it. She had stood firm when they tried to break her, and tomorrow she would begin the impossible task of honoring Jonathan's faith in her. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one act of kindness at a time, until she became the leader he'd believed she already was. 3 days later, Ebony walked through the Anderson mansion with a different stride, not the hesitant steps of a woman expecting to be cast out, but the measured pace of someone who belonged there, who had earned her place not through manipulation or luck, but through the simple act of loving a man who valued integrity over image. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the crystal chandeliers and casting rainbow prisms across the marble floors.
She'd walked these halls dozens of times before, but always as a guest, always aware that James and Mabel saw her as temporary, disposable, someone who would eventually be replaced by a more appropriate match for their brother. Now, the mansion was hers. Every room, every painting, every carefully curated piece of the Anderson legacy. The weight of it should have crushed her. Instead, it felt strangely right, like slipping into a coat that had been tailored specifically for her measurements. She paused in the portrait gallery, where generations of Andersons stared down from their gilded frames. Stern-faced patriarchs who had built the family fortune, elegant matriarchs who had maintained its social standing, and there, at the end of the row, Jonathan. His portrait had been commissioned 2 years before his death, when he was still healthy, still vibrant. The artist had captured something essential about him, the kindness in his eyes, the slight smile that suggested he found the whole formality of sitting for a portrait slightly ridiculous. Ebony stood before it, the morning light illuminating his painted face. "They're gone," she said softly, speaking to the portrait as if Jonathan could hear her. James and Mabel. Christopher had their personal items packed and sent to their respective addresses. The transition team has been notified. The board meets tomorrow to officially acknowledge the change in leadership. She clutched the envelope, Jonathan's letter, which she'd been carrying with her constantly since the reading. It had become a talisman, a reminder of why she was doing this. "You said something to me once," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "About 3 months before you died, we were in bed, and you were having one of your bad nights. Couldn't sleep because of the pain. You held my hand and said, 'If they don't respect you in life, let them bow in truth after I'm gone.'" She smiled through tears. "I didn't understand what you meant then. I thought you were just being dramatic, the way you got sometimes when the medication made you philosophical. But you were telling me, weren't you? You were preparing me for all of this." The painted eyes seemed to look at her with that familiar mixture of love and mischief. "They're bowing now," Ebony said quietly. "Not because they want to, but because the truth left them no choice. Marcus Chen has already requested a meeting to discuss collaborative opportunities. Veronica Chen sent flowers with an apology note. Even Robert Harrison, who barely acknowledged my existence before, has been offering unsolicited advice about board management." She laughed softly, sadly. "They're bowing, just like you said they would. But Jonathan, it doesn't feel like victory. It just feels lonely. I wish you were here. I wish I could ask you if I'm doing this right, if I'm making the decisions you would have made." The mansion was quiet around her, the morning staff moving through their duties with practiced discretion. Clara had briefed her on everything: the household schedules, the maintenance requirements, the small daily rituals that kept the estate running smoothly. It was overwhelming, and yet somehow manageable. Because Jonathan had been right about one thing: she was stronger than she'd believed. She'd survived the worst day of her life. She'd stood in front of people who wanted to destroy her and refused to break. And now she was standing in the aftermath, not as a victim, but as the person responsible for ensuring that what Jonathan built would continue to matter. "I'll honor your trust," she whispered to the portrait. "I promise you, I'll protect what you valued. I'll take care of the people who depend on us, and I'll try, God, I'll try so hard to be worthy of the faith you had in me." The portrait, of course, didn't answer. But in the silence, Ebony felt something that might have been peace beginning to take root. 3 months later, the Anderson Enterprises quarterly board meeting was nothing like Ebony had imagined. She'd expected confrontation, resistance, barely concealed hostility from executives who resented taking orders from someone they'd dismissed as unqualified. Instead, she found herself leading a discussion about expanding the Employee Education Fund, the same initiative James had blocked, and receiving unanimous approval. "The numbers are compelling," Robert Harrison said, reviewing the proposal on his tablet. "Investing in employee development shows a consistent return in productivity and retention." "I'm surprised we didn't implement this sooner." Because James cared more about quarterly earnings than long-term sustainability, Ebony thought but didn't say. She'd learned quickly that changing culture required patience, not accusations. "Then we're agreed?" she asked, looking around the conference table. The education fund launches next quarter, with an initial budget of $5 million. Nods all around. Excellent. Now regarding the environmental audit Marcus has been leading. As the meeting continued, Ebony found herself settling into the role in ways she hadn't anticipated. She didn't have Jonathan's encyclopedic knowledge of the business or James's ruthless strategic mind, but she had something else, the ability to listen, to ask the right questions, to push for solutions that valued people as much as profits. And slowly, very slowly, it was working. After the meeting, Marcus approached her with a genuine smile. "You're doing great," he said. "Seriously. I know I didn't believe it at first, but you're exactly what this company needed." "Thank you," Ebony said. "That means a lot, especially coming from you." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Yeah, about that. About what I said before." "You're here now," Ebony interrupted gently. "Working hard, contributing ideas, treating people with respect. That's what matters." As she left the building that evening, her driver, a kind man named Thomas, who had worked for the Andersons for 15 years, held the door open for her. "How was your day, Mrs. Anderson?" "Productive," she said, settling into the back seat. "Challenging, but good." "Mr. Jonathan would be proud," Thomas said quietly. Everyone kept saying that, and each time Ebony hoped desperately that it was true. 6 months later, Clara found Ebony in Jonathan's garden on a Tuesday afternoon, deadheading roses exactly as his letter had instructed. "You have a visitor," Clara said carefully. "She's waiting in the west parlor." "Who?" Ebony asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Mabel Anderson." Ebony's first instinct was to refuse, to say she wasn't available, that Mabel should make an appointment through Christopher like everyone else. But then she remembered what Jonathan had written. "I hope this might teach them something." "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Ebony said. "Let her know I'm coming." When she entered the west parlor, Mabel was standing by the window looking out at the grounds. She'd lost weight, Ebony noticed. Her clothes, still expensive but no longer ostentatiously so, hung a bit loose on her frame. "Mabel," Ebony said quietly. The other woman turned, and Ebony was shocked by what she saw in her face. Not the haughty contempt she'd grown accustomed to, but something raw and vulnerable. "Thank you for seeing me," Mabel said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," Ebony admitted. "What can I do for you?" Mabel took a shaky breath. "I came to apologize. Really apologize. Not just the empty words people say when they want something. I came to tell you that you were right. About everything." She sat down heavily on the antique sofa, her composure cracking. "I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what Jonathan said in his will, about measuring worth in dollar signs and power plays. And I realize that's all I've ever done, my whole life. Every relationship, every decision, every interaction was about what I could gain, how I could win, who I could control." Tears streaked down her face. "I lost everything. The company, the status, the lifestyle. And you know what the worst part was? I realized I didn't have anything real underneath it. No genuine friendships, no meaningful relationships, just transactions disguised as connections." Ebony sat down across from her, saying nothing, just listening. "You were right," Mabel continued. "When you said we meant every cruel word. We did, because we genuinely believed you were beneath us. And now I have to live with the fact that the person I treated as worthless is actually everything my brother said you were. Strong, kind, principled, while I'm—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "You're human," Ebony said quietly, "flawed, like all of us, capable of cruelty, but also capable of growth." "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not," Ebony agreed, "but I'm going to offer it anyway, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger would poison me more than it would punish you." Mabel looked up, shocked. "Just like that? After everything?" "Just like that." Ebony leaned forward. "But Mabel, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean we're friends or that things go back to how they were. It means I'm choosing to release my resentment so I can move forward without carrying your cruelty with me." "What do I do now?" Mabel asked, her voice small. "That's up to you," Ebony said. "You can spend the rest of your life bitter about what you lost. Or you can use this as an opportunity to become someone Jonathan might have been proud of, someone who measures success by the lives you improve, not the power you accumulate." After Mabel left, still broken but perhaps beginning to heal, Clara appeared with tea. "That was gracious of you," the housekeeper said. "It was exhausting," Ebony admitted, "but necessary. Jonathan wanted them to learn. I can't force that, but I can at least leave the door open." 1 year later. The annual Anderson Enterprises Charity Gala was Ebony's idea, a way to honor Jonathan's memory while supporting causes he'd cared about. The mansion's grand ballroom glittered with lights, filled with business leaders, philanthropists, and community organizers. As Ebony moved through the crowd, she caught snippets of conversation. "She's transformed the company culture. Employee satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. Profits are up without compromising values. Never underestimate the quiet ones." That last phrase made her smile, because that's exactly what they'd all learned, that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud dominance. That dignity could triumph over cruelty. That integrity, in the end, mattered more than image. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the staff had finished cleaning, Ebony stood once again before Jonathan's portrait. "We did it," she said softly. "Everything you hoped for. The company is thriving, the people are valued, and I really think, you'd be proud of what we've built in your name." She touched her hand to the painted canvas, feeling the texture of dried oil paint beneath her fingers. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing something I couldn't see in myself. Thank you for trusting me with everything you built." The woman who had been kicked, mocked, and humiliated now stood as the undisputed matriarch of the Anderson legacy. Not because she'd sought power, but because she'd remained true to herself even when the world told her she was worthless. That was the real inheritance Jonathan had left her. Not the billions of dollars, or the controlling shares or the mansion, but the proof, irrefutable and permanent, that kindness and integrity could prevail over cruelty and arrogance, even when it seemed impossible, especially then. If this story moved you, reminded you of your own strength, or taught you something about the power of dignity in the face of cruelty, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a like if Ebony's journey resonated with you. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, tales of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of staying true to yourself even when the world tries to break you. And if you're hungry for more stories about underdogs who rise, secrets that change everything, and justice that arrives when you least expect it, check out the videos on your screen right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next, because sometimes the people the world underestimates are exactly the ones who change it.